The smell hit Elias like a physical blow, sharper and more disorienting than any mortar blast he had endured in the last 6 months. It was a smell that should not exist here, a profound, forbidden anomaly cutting through the metallic dust and pervasive dampness of the ruined city block. For days, the world had been muted to a grayscale palette of cold cement, coagulated mud, and the distant, constant whine of incoming artillery. His sensory inputs were fine-tuned only for danger: the sound of a closing bolt, the click of a tripwire, the ozone tang of fresh explosives. Yet here, rising from the pulverized cobblestones of the market square, was the unmistakable aroma of yeast, warm flour, and faintly, very faintly, anise. It was the smell of Sunday mornings, of his mother's kitchen before the sun was fully up, of a life so brutally extinguished by his current reality that acknowledging its existence felt like treason against the survival instinct. Elias, frozen behind a half-toppled fountain statue of a forgotten king, gripped his rifle so hard his knuckles turned white. His squad mates, Corporal Kellen and the young, perpetually coughing Private Jensen, continued their slow sweep toward the designated rendezvous point, oblivious to the sensory ambush that had paralyzed Elias. He could not move. The smell, so pure, so utterly out of place, was a crack in the dam, and the memories were rushing through the breach. He remembered the feeling of flour dust sticking to his fingertips, the warmth radiating from the oven door, the sound of his mother humming a lullaby he hadn't thought of since he was 7. It was a terrifying sensation, because the moment he let the warmth of that memory take root, the necessary protective numbness of the soldier would vanish, leaving him raw, exposed, and useless in this landscape of deliberate desolation. He had to find the source, not to destroy it, but simply to prove it was a trick of the exhausted mind, a phantom scent rising from the wreckage of a lifelong past. The cold air burned his lungs as he inhaled again, chasing the intoxicating ghost of home. Ignoring Kellen's sharp, questioning hand signal, Elias eased himself around the statue, dropping into a low, combat crouch. The smell was stronger downwind, emanating from the debris pile that was once the town hall's western wing. This was the most dangerous approach. The enemy patrols favored this route at dawn, and the rubble offered minimal cover against aimed fire. But logic was secondary now. The scent had become an obsession, a beacon of dangerous sanity in a world dedicated to madness. He moved with practiced silence, each bootfall placed meticulously, testing the stability of the fractured masonry. The closer he got, the more complex the aroma became. Wood smoke, slightly burnt sugar, and that heavy, comforting yeasty scent. It wasn't industrial baking. This was slow, small-batch, defiant cooking. He reached the foot of the rubble pile and spotted the source. A narrow, barely visible gap between 2 massive concrete slabs, framed by a rusted grate half buried in brick dust. Air, distinctly warmer than the 0-degree morning, puffed lightly from the opening. Elias lay flat, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the frozen ground, and drew his pistol. His training screamed at him, "Grenade first, always!" But the image of his mother, flour dusting her brow, stayed his hand. He lowered his head slowly, peering into the shadows. It was a passage leading down, reinforced crudely with salvaged timbers. He heard a faint sound from below, not the clatter of a rifle or the scrape of boots, but a low, rhythmic thud, like something being worked or kneaded. He took a calculated risk that felt less like bravery and more like fatalistic compulsion. He slid the pistol back into its holster, drew his knife, and began to carefully widen the opening, scraping away the loosened mortar, driven by a hunger that transcended mere rations or survival. He needed to know if the warmth was real, if that slice of forgotten humanity truly existed beneath the frost line of their war. The crawl space opened into a small, dry, earthen cellar, surprisingly clean and insulated. The source of the light and heat was a small, ancient brick oven built into the corner. its iron door glowing soft orange. Kneeling beside the oven, entirely framed by the gentle light, was an elderly woman. She was small and skeletal, wearing layers of salvaged wool, her face a geography of worry lines, but her hands were busy. She was rhythmically pressing, folding, and turning a massive dome of dough in a wooden trough, oblivious or perhaps willfully indifferent to the armed soldier who had just dropped silently into her sanctum. Elias stood, wiping the grit from his eyes, his rifle hanging awkwardly from his shoulder. He felt like an intruder, not a conquering soldier. The smell here was suffocatingly wonderful, a total immersion in forgotten domesticity. The old woman finally looked up. Her eyes were milky and calm, not the widened, terrified eyes he was accustomed to seeing. She simply pointed a flour-dusted finger toward a small wooden crate beside her, which held 3 loaves of finished bread, deep brown and steaming slightly. She didn't speak the soldier's language, but the gesture was universal. Eat. He didn't hesitate. He broke off a chunk of the nearest loaf, the crust crackled audibly, and brought it to his mouth. The taste was overwhelming: salt, earth, pure sustenance, and the ghost of that forbidden anise spice. It was the purest, most real thing he had encountered since the war began, and it forced him to remember that the hands that held the rifle were once the hands that held a school book or played catch in a sunlit field. The psychological structure he had built to survive, the one that allowed him to see enemies, not people, splintered. It was this moment of quiet, shared humanity, this simple loaf of bread in the wreckage, that was far more dangerous than any enemy position. It makes you wonder, when faced with an overwhelming force like war, is the greatest act of defiance clinging to a beautiful, fragile memory? Or is it better, perhaps, to let that memory die so you can survive? Take a moment and share your thoughts in the comments on which path offers true survival. Elias sat on an overturned bucket, the silence in the cellar thicker and heavier than the air outside. The old woman continued her kneading, occasionally checking the fire, her actions a meditative resistance against the chaos above. He ate half the loaf slowly, chewing each mouthful deliberately, trying to anchor himself in the reality of the warmth and the simple taste. With the restoration of his physical senses came the unbearable sharpness of emotional clarity. It wasn't just the bread, it was the entire atmosphere. The soft clinking of her wedding ring against the wooden bowl, the faint coal dust smell mixed with the baking yeast, the shadow of a small framed photograph resting on a shelf, likely a husband or son lost to the conflict. These weren't the artifacts of an enemy position, they were the holy remnants of a life he recognized, a life he had been actively participating in destroying through proximity and action. He thought of the young enemy soldier he had taken out 3 days prior, barely older than Jensen, slumped against a barricade, his pockets containing nothing but a damp letter and a smooth, river-worn stone. Did that boy have a mother who baked bread in a hidden cellar? Did he carry the scent of home with him too? The realization that he had extinguished a life capable of this same profound human normalcy solely because of a line drawn on a map was debilitating. The warmth of the cellar, which had initially been a comfort, began to feel like a scorching indictment. He felt a desperate urge to apologize, not just to the old woman, but to the ghosts of everyone he had hardened himself against. He stayed for nearly an hour, speaking no words, simply existing in the presence of pure, non-military purpose. He watched her gently cover the finished dough with a clean white cloth, an action so mundane, so confident in the hope of tomorrow, that it utterly dwarfed the grand scale of their endless war. He knew he could not stay. He could not carry this level of truth back into the trenches. He had to go, but he knew the man who crawled out of the cellar would be fundamentally broken by the knowledge of what he had lost and what he was destroying. Elias stood up, the movement stiff after the unexpected reprieve. He left the remains of his rations, a tin of beef and a packet of dry coffee, on the lip of the kneading trough, a poor, silent exchange for the resurrection of his soul. The old woman looked up again, her expression still unreadable, merely nodding once, a small, weary acknowledgement of his departure. He didn't risk a farewell, afraid the sound of his voice would betray the torrent of grief flooding his chest. Climbing out into the cold, gray morning felt like re-entering a foreign country, a harsh, metallic planet where warmth and the scent of yeast were illegal, toxic elements. The world was now louder, the distant rumble of the front line sharper, the cold wind slicing through the thin armor of his resolve. He rejoined Kellen and Jensen, offering only a grunt of explanation for his delay, the taste of the illicit bread still on his tongue. They saw only a man returned from a brief, necessary patrol. They did not see the man who had just witnessed the destruction of his own inner armor. He carried the smell with him, a faint ghost clinging to his coat, a secret that made the trenches heavier, the enemy positions clearer, and his own existence profoundly, unbearably pointless. He continued the patrol, now acutely aware that the fight was no longer against the enemy, but against the memory of warmth and the profound, simple truth that someone, somewhere, was still baking bread. He had faced bullets and bombs and had held his line, but it was the smell of home that had truly broken the soldier. If this somber, deeply personal reflection on war's quiet psychological toll resonated with you, and if you seek the stories found in the shadows, please subscribe to Quiet Soldier Stories. We explore the small moments that change the world inside us. He had faced bullets and bombs and had held his line, but it was the smell of home that had truly broken the soldier.